I'd like to talk a little bit about George Harrison and George's spiritual quest in our series about George. George, at this point, is over in India. He's on retreat with the Maharishi yoga, yoga. And he kind of convinced his fellow bandmates in the Beatles to go along with him on this retreat. And interesting the reaction of the different Beatles to this. Ringo and his wife left after 2 weeks. Ringo felt the food was too spicy, couldn't get used to the food, and the bugs bothered him. Paul was, he a lot longer. He was there for a whole month. He left after a month. John, interestingly, he left when he discovered that the Maharishi had acted inappropriately with some of the female disciples. He said, this doesn't look too good. I mean, he's trying to be a spiritual leader, but yet look how he's relating to some of these disciples and having kind of, sexual encounters with them. And John was, what's with him being spiritual and yet doing this? John couldn't put, that together. George stayed. He didn't leave. He stayed because he had grown so much from the teachings. The teachings of the Maharishi really impacted him. And so he was like, I'm not leaving. I'm hanging in here. And also the practice of meditation that the Maharishi had encouraged him in. That really meant a lot to him. He was discovering a spiritual path, a peaceful path, and so he wanted to continue with that. George, really, after this period of retreat with the Maharishi, became extremely productive, and he was inspired to write a lot of new music, his own music. So this really impacted him, not only spiritually, but even artistically. It really opened up new avenues for him. On the other hand, though, the Beatles themselves, unfortunately, were falling apart. By July of 1968, there was constant tension, there was arguing, it wasn't fun to be together anymore, there was a lot of this bickering back and forth, and so it was a difficult time in their life as a musical group. George, though, started to feel kind of alone in his spiritual quest. Uh, the three people that he loved the most, John, Paul, and Ringo, they really didn't share the same spiritual quest that George was on. They had other things going in their lives, and it didn't seem that they were on the same wavelength with George at this point. And so that was a great difficulty for him as well. But he did meet an American at this time, in 68, who was devoted to Indian spirituality, uh, Shamasundar. And Shamasundar came by the headquarters of Apple Records one day, and a lot of people would go. There was kind of like a magnet to draw people. Apple Records, let's go and see if we can see some of the Beatles and all of that. And accidentally, I guess because the way he was dressed in robes and stuff, Yoko Ono let him in, thinking he was probably a friend of George's from India. And so we came in, and he was a disciple, Shamasundar, of Swami Prabhupada. And George knew about the Swami from his recordings of the Krishna chanting. So they had this immediate connection. George was aware of the Swami and really had helped him with his Krishna chanting. And so immediately they kind of bonded over that. Shamasundar told George that of all of the other Hebrew deities, they were subordinate to Krishna. Because there's all this concern about, well, which deity should I be involved with? And Shamasunder said, don't worry about all of the panoply of the different deities and different, families, regions, and all of that. Krishna is kind of supreme, and so follow Krishna and the teachings of Krishna. They met again at George and Patty's home, and George was able to discuss his religious questions with Shamasunder. So there's this bonding that's going, and really very important for George to have somebody that he could turn to talk about his religion, talk about his chanting, talk about his spirituality, talk about his relationship with the Almighty and with all of creation. It's so very important for George. George met the group that Shamasunder was living with in the Hare Krishna warehouse in London. Uh, Malati, Shamasundar's wife, Yamunda, Mukunda, he had sent a letter to George, and George actually remembered that letter. It's funny that sometimes you send letters about to different people, and you think, well, they're never going to see them; they're too famous. But this particular letter, having to deal with Indian spirit and this bonding occurred with George and Mukunda. Uh, he also met Garudas, who worked with Martin Luther King Jr. So again, there was this bond. He was involved in Indian spirituality, but also this passion for social justice and for helping those who were being discriminated against and exploited. So that connection between religion, spirituality, and justice was very important for George as well. He met Saraswati, who was a child. George was also introduced to Radha, and Radha is God's feminine side. It's very important to realize when we speak about the spirituality, the importance of the balance of the male and the female. So the feminine side of God, the sense of this tenderness and mercy of God, very important in all spiritual traditions. That's why you have, the god, the goddess, but very important in Indian spirituality as well. Of course, as we see within Christianity, that importance of the speaking of God, uh, many of the scriptures from Isaiah, that sense of the feminine aspect of God, the caring, the motherly, uh, the tender aspect of it, very important as well. And so George was discovering this through Radha. You also learned about Chaitanya, who started chanting Hare Krishna in the streets in the 16th century in Bengal. And so there he was going around chanting and drawing people because of the chanting, the repetition, the solemnity, the intensity of the chanting attracted people. It did in the 16th century, it did in the 20th and the 21st centuries. It's a sense of wanting to kind of formalize a relationship with God through the chanting, that sense of peacefulness, that sense of the rhythm of life, of the respect for all of life that comes from the chanting. Very important that George discovered that. That really is going to become part of his spirituality now, ongoing. The importance of chanting, and of course, we see it in many different religious traditions, not only in the Hindu tradition, but of course in the Buddhist tradition, the Christian tradition, the importance of the chanting and this rhythm that is established through the chanting, the solemnity of the chanting, uh, the entering into another aspect of self through the chanting. So it becomes very important to establish that inner peace in terms of one's relationship with God through the chanting. Uh, and so they started this group that Samasundar introduced George to. They started now singing together. They started meditating and praying together. George had a group. He had a community. We see here the importance of a community, and that is so crucial in terms of religious development. So this really is a significant moment in George's spiritual life. This idea of first the retreat with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and how through the Maharishi's teachings and his particularly about meditation were very helpful to George, and now through meeting Samasundar and his community, and the chanting and the praying together, extremely important in George's spiritual life. And this is going to flow over into his artistic life, his retreat, very fruitful in terms of music, creativity, new ideas, and this now is going to really impact his career as a musician as well.